That's pretty good, not who you were expecting. Is this on? Well, good afternoon, everybody. I just continue to marvel by the weirdness of COVID, because the last time I was with a group and in front of a group was the Holiday Sing, which seems like many, many months ago. But it is just so wonderful to be with people again and back in the space and to have a guest artist here in person as opposed to on a screen. So I'm really excited about today. And I'm really honored and pleased to be able to welcome Vijay Iyer back to Eastman as the most recent of our many outstanding guests in the Glenn E. Watkins Lecture Series. In the past, the series has included Leon Fleischer, Joanna Falletta, Jeremy Dank, to name only three. And all of the speakers in this series have distinguished themselves as outstanding performers of music who also have important things to say about music. The title of Mr. Iyer's presentation this afternoon is Musicality. I don't think anybody will contradict me when I describe him as an authority in this area. And I'm really pleased to be able to say that he received some significant early training and education here at Eastman. He has said, Eastman School of Music has played a role in my life since childhood. I remember attending concerts in Kilbourne Hall, taking music theory courses, playing in string quartets, and attending the Summer Jazz Workshop in 1987. All these experiences helped me make me the artist I am today. Vijay Iyer's career compromises many careers as a composer, bandleader, producer, and writer, and for good measure, a, quote, social conscious, multimedia collaborator, system builder, rhapsodist, historical thinker, and multicultural gateway, end quote, in the words of the New York Times. He's carved out a unique path as an influential, prolific, shape-shifting presence in 21st century music. His work across multiple musical communities and his consistently innovative and emotionally resonant body of work have made him a leading music maker of his generation. He has received a MacArthur Fellowship, a Doris Duke Performing Artist Award, a United Artists Fellowship, a Grammy nomination, the Albert Award in the Arts, 2 German Echo Awards, and was voted Downbeat Magazine Jazz Artist of the Year 4 times in the last decade. He's been praised by Pitchfork as one of the best in the world at what he does, by the Los Angeles Weekly as a boundless and deeply important young star, and by Minnesota Public Radio as an American treasure. Whether he's working independently or in collaboration with other great composers and performers, he is consistently imaginative and innovative creator of music and thinker about music, whether that music can be described as jazz or classical or anything else. By any measure, Vijay Iyer is an exemplar of musicality in all its forms, and we are delighted to present him in our Glenn E. Watkins Lecture Series. Please welcome Vijay Iyer and his many-faceted musicality.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm going to take this off. It's great to see you all. Thanks for being here today. Thank you, Dean Rossi, for that very kind introduction. Yeah, you may recognize that little bit of kitsch from Cafe Fuego. It's up on the wall there. If you walk, if you're right where you enter, I saw it yesterday and thought it would be suitable for today's, to kick things off. I don't know. It seems to tell all kinds of stories. I'm not sure which one is me, but yeah. I want to extend a warm thank you to my hosts today for making this virtual visit smooth and luxurious. Holly Watkins, Wendy Borden, Jeff Campbell, Jamal Rossi, the great keyboardist, Gary Versace, Dave, who shuttled me around, Mike, who got the audio working, and Darren Mueller, everyone else involved in making this happen, and especially to the wonderful student music makers and scholars who shared their thoughts with me today. I'd like to dedicate today's talk to my father. He loved music, he loved life, he loved me, he loved everyone. Some of you might have known him. I wish he could be here today, but instead I'm certain he'll somehow be speaking through me. I've spent most of the last few decades as a composer-performer out in the world. 8 years ago, I also began teaching at Harvard, carving out a role for myself as an artist in I think I'd call it an eccentric orbit around the academy. I live in New York City, but I'm speaking to you today as a local. I grew up in Fairport, graduated from FHS in 1988. My earliest musical memory, indeed perhaps my earliest memory at all, is from that house in Fairport when I was 3 or 4. I had started violin lessons, and my beloved older sister, Prima, then 6 or 7, had started on piano. My parents had gotten her a modest spinet on which she could work through her Suzuki repertoire. Her little piano loomed grandly over me and my 16th size violin. Similarly, I found myself looking up to her as my sentinel and guide through childhood. One day I heard her playing something I did not recognize from the Suzuki practice tapes. She was clanging around in what was probably A minor. It involved a lot of white keys and sustain pedal. At some point, either that time or the next, I toddled up beside her and clanged along in counterpoint. Together we got the instrument resonating and shaking until it felt like it might tip over. I call this a musical memory. Is that the right word for it? Little me, together with one of my favorite people in the world, engaged in collaborative exploratory play, forming sonic experience, making a joyful noise, surely breaking a rule or two. Even then I must have thought, could this be music too? Instantly I was hooked, and quite truthfully, to this day, every time I play the piano, some part of me is transported back to that ecstatic, timeless, transgressive moment from childhood. You could call it my origin story. When I was a teenager in the 1980s, I took violin lessons with the great Oliver Steiner, who was then a professor here at Eastman. A contemporary of Itzhak Perlman, Emanuel Ax, Pinchas Zuckerman, and others. He had been a pupil of the legendary Dorothy DeLay, the Juilliard pedagogue. My father used to drive me to Mr. Steiner's home in Brighton for lessons every week, and many insights from those lessons have stayed with me ever since. Aiming to refine my playing, Mr. Steiner used to call for fluidity of motion in my bow arm, my wrist, my fingers, my shifting. He used to demonstrate on the giant rubber plant in the corner of his studio. He would give one of its dinner plate-sized leaves a nudge with his bow, and he would ask me to observe the plant's undulating response, the gentle oscillatory sway of a branch. With warmth and sincerity and perhaps a little mischief, he'd say, "That's how I want you to play the violin." As I mentioned, my father loved music. One time on a night that I can't forget, perhaps in 1987, my father was driving me home from Mr. Steiner's house because I didn't get my license until I was 17, so I was a late bloomer. In the car, as he drove down Elmwood Avenue, I put on a cassette of some piece of music with an infectious rhythm that somehow caught hold of my dad's soul. He turned up the volume, started tapping along, doubling the steering wheel. Then rolling his neck to the beat. Then singing along, making up his own tune. Then honking the horn in wild spasms of joy, irrespective of other drivers or the quiet houses around us. The awkward teenage me was mortified by this madcap eruption from my otherwise mild-mannered father. These three scenes, my sister's and my cacophonous clanging, Mr. Steiner's swaying plant, my dad's little bit of car horn ruckus, they bring me to the question I'd like to ask today. How does what we might call musicality emerge in such unlikely moments from objects or actions that do not seem to belong in the category we know as music? How does ordinary experience become musical? As you've heard, I am a music maker who has made it my practice to explore the limits of what I think music is, or what it has been to me. I've made plenty of music of my own, and I've also been fortunate to collaborate with music makers across genres, communities, and generations, and with poets and rappers and dancers, filmmakers, visual artists. I am also occasionally, and even a little reluctantly, a music scholar. My early academic work, beginning with my 1998 dissertation, developed a conception of embodied music cognition, informed by Black music makers, Black musical systems, and Black methods, critically confronting the Eurocentric frameworks of music theory, musicology, and music cognition. I have argued for an understanding of music as first and foremost embodied human action, the sounds of bodies in motion. As the composer-pianist Cecil Taylor once put it, what music is everything that you do. I was led into this line of thinking in the 1990s and 2000s through the generosity of various Black music makers and thinkers across generations. George Lewis, Ollie Wilson, Robert Porter, Donald Bailey, E.W. Wainwright, Muhammad Bilal, Will Power, Steve Coleman, Imani Uzuri, Amiri Baraka, Butch Morris, Roscoe Mitchell, Amina Claudine Myers, Wadada Leo Smith, Jerry Allen, and many, many others. It was through Black music-making communities that I first came in contact with generations of philosophical, literary, historical, and political thought that today go under the name of Black Studies. This vast field encompasses both constructive and deconstructive work. Writers and theorists from W.E.B. Du Bois to Zora Neale Hurston to Amiri Baraka to Houston Baker have identified and theorized aesthetics of Afro-diasporic expressive practices. These projects exist in productive counterpoint with the trenchant interventions of Black feminist theorists, including Hortense Spillers, Sylvia Wynter, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, Imani Perry, and many others who have sought, by training the critical tools of literary and historical analysis on the archive itself, to destabilize and topple the conceit of Western man as the idealized transcendental subject. I'm offering these lists of names to highlight how humanities methods have challenged what is known, partly by looking beneath existing systems of knowledge and investigating their emergent histories. Today's humanities scholars must ask the hard questions. Who gets to define what is knowledge and what isn't, and why? Who are the supposed repositories of knowledge? Who gets to hold knowledge? How is knowledge held, stockpiled, transferred, and by whom, and why? These questions are nagging ones, annoying, repetitive, even tedious, but these are questions that have brought about the epistemological revolutions of the last 5 or 6 decades. They are why, for example, Black studies and feminist and queer theory and Latinx studies and Asian American studies and Muslim American studies and Native American studies have given space for the production of new forms of knowledge and have transformed our understanding of the violent, imperial, and genocidal histories of the last 5 centuries that brought all of us to the Onondaga, Seneca, and Haudenosaunee lands on which we are gathered today. These persistent humanities questions are the reason why, only 30 years ago, it was finally possible to say out loud that women's rights are human rights. Why today it is also finally possible and crucial to say that Black lives matter and that trans rights are human rights. And why we can finally say, and must say in addition, that no human being is illegal. And why we stand behind the courageous students who stand up against their abusive teachers and mentors. The pattern here is that the most trenchant humanities questions have literally extended the category of the human being. They have revealed this category to be not just biologically given, but evolving and contested, constructed, regulated, constrained by powerful institutions, the state, the law, the church, the university, the conservatory. For some time, I've been fixated on the ideas of music and the human being as 2 contested, overlapping categories, with the understanding that neither one is a pre-given or objective designation, that instead both music and the human are political and ideological formations. I've argued elsewhere that the category of the human, that contentious, fraught, conceptual battlefield, is also the category of music. What I mean is that far from being a biological fact or an objective truth, music, too, is an ideological battleground, a space that is not universally agreed upon, but is discursively constructed and policed to make it seem as if it were so. The music made by people on the edges of the category of the human, the abject, the dispossessed, the incarcerated, the illegal, the disabled, the marginal. Those sounds are similarly ejected, violently hurled outside of the category of music. So we have to historicize our contemporary use of the word music. We must re-examine that word as a contingent and unfixed and historically specific concept. Our understanding of music today is bound up with our technologically mediated and market-dependent listening experiences, which condition us to think of music as an object or a substance that can be consumed and stockpiled. But remember, we're only able to think of music as a permanent object because of sound recording technology, which isn't that old in the scheme of things. If it weren't for that, we would only think of it as an activity, something temporary and ephemeral, something we do together, or that others do for us. Our conception of music additionally depends on Western models of aurality, instrumentality, humanity, animality that emerged in the last half millennium of European imperialism, exploration, enlightenment, enslavement, genocide, extraction. As European so-called explorers encountered their racialized others in the New World and in their other colonies, They believed indigenous people to be at the edge of the human category and took their musical behaviors as noise. They, like today's scientists, discursively delimited what human music must and must not be. Instead, we must listen beyond our last century of sound mediation and beyond the last 5 centuries of racial capitalism that undergird Western thought, Western science, reason, and re-examine what music might have been on a time scale of at least 100,000 years, the era of human sociality, the time scale of humanity itself. Over here is an artifact from Blombos Cave in coastal South Africa that is 75,000 years old. And it's found in a cave that contains other artifacts that are up to 100,000 years old. So this is a site where people gathered and made things. This is a piece of art. That crosshatch pattern was made by a human hand. So we've been doing stuff like that for a long time. I often remind students that anytime you use the first person plural, for example, in the sentence, "What might music do for us?" they're making an implicit claim to a unified us, invoking a fuzzy universal, a category that not only includes but also invariably excludes. Many listeners or readers might find themselves on the margins of that implicit category. To put it plainly, black and brown people who do not always experience a sense of belonging within a Western ideal of a universal sense of us. In this way, what we call subjectivity is not just about private or inner experience. It is the means by which you relate your inner world to your notion of us. A sense of not just who you are, but who speaks for you, who your people are. And in practice, the term music does something similar. When you use that word, you may already have a category in your mind, a boundary between what music is and what it is not. Such a boundary between music and non-music is hazy, tenuous. More to the point, it is not an objective boundary, but a cultural designation, one that is the result of implicit agreements among members of a community. In short, the category of music is an ideological and a politically charged one, much like the notion of us, indeed, the contested category of the human being. In fall of 2020, aiming to pry open the category of music, I posed a question on Twitter following the form of a popular meme. What's not music, but feels like music to you? This post received an avalanche of responses. You can see a few of them. Cooking, a really good conversation. Longing, dancing, weather, grandparents, people being insulted in Yoruba, construction sites, water droplets, door creaks, astrological planet alignments, white noise, difference tones, my youngest son's gentle snore, my older son's footsteps, my daughter's laughter, the wind through desiccating leaves, dogs barking, shafts of sunlight through slow-moving clouds, astrology, astrophysics, poetry, the crunch of leaves on a crisp Chicago autumn day, looking deeply in the eyes of a lover, traffic, the groove a washing machine or dishwasher gets into, the ocean, love, memories, roller coasters, touch, thought, everything. That was an answer. Hundreds of people from around the planet offered examples of what feels like music, eliminating the contested edges of the category, tracing out a larger space of what I would call sonic mattering, affectively charged attending to sensory experience. These included human and non-human actions, complex sensations, emotions, thoughts, meaningful social relations. The category of music as we know it encompasses many behaviors, but is also, as demonstrated here, surrounded by this vast sea of experiences that feel like they belong in the category too. So rather than pursue a definitive question like what is music, we can ask more inclusively, what in the realm of human experience might feel like music? Under what circumstances, how, and why? And what do we even mean by that question? What does it mean to feel like music? Feelings are not trivial. They are somatic activations at the intersection of biology and culture. As the tweets revealed, virtually any experience can feel like music to somebody, and they cannot be proven wrong. For music is felt into being. We must therefore treat the category of music not as one that closes or coheres, but instead as a sphere of experience, opening out endlessly to human possibility. All of this, has led me to a consideration not of music per se, but of musicality. Why musicality? Because there's something wrong with it. I care about what words do, and this M word first began to trouble me productively a few years ago. In English, the term has at least two senses. In the realm of aesthetics, as many musicians here know, it connotes musicalness, a communicative, affective value, the quality of being musical. Musicality is not the same as musicianship, that technical ability to, quote unquote, play well. Musicality seems to refer to a process of calling or hailing a listener into a shared experience, a shared feeling. To use the language of capture, it's about grabbing a listener's attention. Good performances of music are often described circularly as very musical. Which then, what do you say about the rest of it? The music that's not musical, what does that mean? Meanwhile, in scientific studies of music, the term musicality is used to posit a biologically determined capacity for music making, a capacity that presumably all humans share. In recent years, the so-called music sciences, the fields variously known as psychology of music, music perception, cognition, neuroscience of music, biology of music, and so forth, have coalesced around this research program concerning the origins of musicality, a methodical inquiry into how humans became musical creatures. There's the rub. As a biological capacity, the object of scientific study, music is said to be possessed by all humans, even the ones who don't actively make or even listen to music. But as an aesthetic judgment, musicality reveals itself only among a select few. Musicality is both ubiquitous, that is species-wide, and exceedingly rare, attainable only in moments within music. Musicality traces out somehow a signifying domain that both precedes and exceeds the category of music. It's inside and outside the category. That's not a problem, but it does seem to represent an opportunity for thinking anew. If musicality denotes a human capacity for music, but these categories, music and human, and for that matter, capacity, are each radically unstable, how might we think anew about musicality? What new musicalities can we discern or imagine challenging the edges of the category? We might start by moving away from the notion of music as an object or substance separable from us as musical beings. This is rather difficult to do since in the modern era we are so accustomed to experiencing music without bodies, what Pierre Schaeffer called acousmatic music, music whose source is absent. But if we accept ethnomusicologist Christopher Small's use of music as a verb, an activity, music king, then we can ascribe musicality to actions and relations rather than beings and objects. We shift away from being music to individuals or groups doing something musical, behaving musically together. Crucially, this implicates the listener in a social relation. Indeed, since music is generally made by people and was hardly ever experienced in isolation until the recording technologies of the last century or two, we should understand a musical encounter as a type of social encounter. Not very long ago, before the advent of recorded music, when you heard music, you were necessarily among other people. Music was being made in your midst. You were witnessing or participating in musical activity, musical actions, musicking. Or, alternatively, in solitude, one might have heard music simply living on in one's head. Musicality for one. That experience we all know when in the ear and mind of the beholder, the song lives on. We might describe this living on as an animacy, a sign of life. Think of how the term earworm describes a kind of wriggling aliveness, as if a melody is tagging along with your inner self, like a friend or a pet or perhaps a pest. So the hearer of music, whether real or imagined, might then be said to be experiencing a kind of co-presence. So could musicality represent a trace or vestige of another being? We are then led to consider not just the material's subjectivity, but the perceivers. That is, how might musicality play a role in the construction of the subject, the I who hears, the I who feels, thinks, acts. Is musicality a reminder of intersubjectivity, an assurance that one is not alone? Musicality then refers to how we, there's that we again, hear another person, a spirit, an animacy, a subject. How music becomes attributed to a musicking body. How I, as a listener, become subject to another. In other words, to experience musicality is to enter into a social relation with another being, to accept them as capable of hailing or addressing you, to hear the call and feel that it is meant for you. And yet, most of our so-called listening practices are founded on an outright denial of personhood, of coexistence. Most of the time, without thinking about it, we tune out the ubiquitous music that wallpapers modern life. We tune out the labor of the instrumentalists and singing voices, the composers, the producers. We relegate it to the background. we automatically judge its maker's actions as irrelevant. We have learned how not to hear a them as part of an us. We mostly refuse to allow sociality or musicality. We routinely do not consent to being serenaded by strangers. Given our habitual filtering out of other people's sonic actions, this thing we call musicality might then be a special sticky quality within music or within musicking, some attribute of a musical act that captures your ear, draws your attention, facilitating for the observer a kind of break from their own internal flow of experience. One waits or attends or listens because one is somehow captured, intrigued, held, arrested. A few years ago, the music theorist Christopher Hastie and I held a joint seminar at Harvard, also titled Musicality. Yes, I've been on this kick for a while now. One participant, the music theorist Anna Wong, at one point described her experience of musicality in witnessing a performance of traditional Chinese choreography. She played a video. This bit of choreography involved mostly motion of the hands in a synchronized fashion between two dancers. As we were watching it, in her description, she spontaneously uttered a phrase that has stuck with me ever since. You feel guided. She said, right there, you feel guided. You feel guided. The you, who is that you in you feel guided? The attending subject, that is you, observer, who deign to hear another as a fellow being worthy of your attention. This is a grammatical use of the word you that is intentionally non-specific, invoking a shared subjectivity, much like the pronouns we or one. The word feel in you feel guided locates this response in the realm of affect, experiential intensity, emotion. The word guided suggests the recognition of an action as a made thing, a done thing, considered, intended thing. You sense the trace of the hand or the body or the ear or the aesthetic of another, the mark of another soul having taken action to enliven your experiential surroundings. Guided also suggests a kind of submission to the order imposed by this other person. It's what we in the West depend on from the greats, the great composers, the great performers, great authors, great playwrights, great actors. It is much like what Michel Foucault called the author function, a paternalistic relation maintained by a belief in some divine governing presence, the presumed godlike genius behind the work. In other words, the word guided is somehow about power and subjection. Anna Wong's felicitous phrase, you feel guided, reveals the entanglement of subjectivity and affect and power at the heart of musicality. So if musicality is an aesthetic term referring to how or when music establishes its own musicalness, how human action becomes musical, that is, if we repurpose this strange word as a critical concept, opening up the category of music as continually being made and remade, then we can start to pay attention to how new musicalities, plural, emerge. New embodied relations among beings and objects. A young girl and her little brother attacking the piano. a violin teacher nudging a plant leaf for his student, a father joyously honking along to the car stereo. It was through the revolutionary musical vision of my many mentors, collaborators, and forebears that I've become the artist I am today. Most of these artists, as I mentioned, have been Black or Afro-diasporic musicians who created their work against all odds, often developing radically speculative music in the context of true oppression, dispossession, danger, and white supremacist terror. Somehow they would find themselves often imagining at and across the edge of what music has been, surpassing the existing terms by which music was understood. In approaching these speculative musicalities of Black music makers, we are bearing witness to scenes of insurgent sonic world building, Black sonic actions becoming musical, affording intercorporeal movement and pleasure and release and ascension. In the time we have left, I'd like us to bear witness to a few of these scenes now. First, I'll offer a few quotes that I think can frame our listening. David Lionel Smith, in an essay called "What is Black Culture?" What then is Black culture? No one can answer these questions definitively because Black culture, quote unquote, is not a fixed single thing out there in the empirical world. It is rather a complex and ambiguous set of processes and interactions, facts and fantasies, assertions and inquiries, passionately held and passionately contested. As a counterpoint from Christina Sharp, living as I've argued that we do in the wake of slavery, in spaces where we were never meant to survive or have been punished for surviving and for daring to claim or make spaces of something like freedom. We yet reimagine and transform spaces for and practices of an ethics of care, as in repair, maintenance, attention, an ethics of seeing and of being in the wake as consciousness. And lastly, Jana Brown, from a book that came out just last year, Black Utopias, Speculative Life and the Music of Other Worlds. The utopias I find in the speculative worlds of radical Black visionaries bring into question definitions of well-being based in a liberal humanist model of the possessive individual, a model that directs us to limited notions of freedom. The art and practices I consider involve a radical refusal of the terms by which selfhood and subjectivity are widely lived and understood. Now I'm going to attempt a bit of a multimedia experiment here. Even in his later years, they had to pry Duke Ellington away from the piano every night after any given concert. Well, after the music stands and instruments and microphones and scores were all packed up, a mop pushed across the floor. A lone figure still sat, building, searching, gnarled hands still probing the instrument. His road manager would walk over, lean on him, point at his watch. Time to go. The tendency is to reach for the anecdote about how the man spoke or how he walked, what he wore, what he ate, as if these things made him great. But the laborious, unglamorous zone of music making is the same for everyone. A great equalizer, full of small failures and dead ends. Abandoned drafts, ideas created and annihilated in an instant, and yet suffused with an ethic of care and discernment. The unnerving truth is that this is what made him great, and could indeed make anyone great. A lifetime's worth of tireless, self-assured pursuit, unpacking, scrutiny, and refinement of one idea, and the next idea, and the next, and the next. What first strikes the ear is a composerly bearing, an attitude towards construction, a way of building or assembling, which is what composing means, with the fundamental contours of interval. And I say bearing because he puts his torso in it. You might say that his very stance is audible. There is an insistent repetition with gesture, the telltale mark of the hands. Specifically, his shimmering fingers, rhythmic excitations. There is an affinity for deep, clangorous vibration, a majestic tolling of the piano's resonant chamber like a great bell. A solo piano introduction would plumb the dark, thick, murky depths of a song, then echo them an octave above in dyads. Then he would set the pulse rolling, majestically, effortlessly, without force. A plain-spoken melody contains within it a longing, sorrow, hope, dignity, grandeur. The left hand guides, shapes, and pushes from below, while the right hand carves from above. It tells, it sings, it spits knowledge, it traces truths. The refinement of touch, the attention to weight and texture and melodic shape. We have not yet understood what his right hand's lyrical gestural insistence meant. We lack the vocabulary to describe what work his unnameable chords did. What were these ancient futures? Prima is a Sanskrit word, she says, and it translates to divine love. A deep pedal tone, widely spread chords encompassing all that is within reach. Tremolos bloom, a left-hand melody tolls, deep roots shift. An orchestral polyphony gathering enough energy through a piano to conjure a multitude, grab hold of the treble, carry the pain and the healing force at once, declaiming to the heavens, or is it from them? Each modulation upward feels like the turning of a season. The possibility of change itself, offering the sustenance of optimism amid our foreboding cries. We are held by all that she bears, her austerities. The sustained tremolo throughout marks the sheer work of this magnanimous, selfless, divine, maternal love, the work of the hands, a dramatic move to major, to joy, hope, a prayer answered. As she once said, the key to being an artist is giving abundantly. Cascading lines in exaltation, a goddess's blessing. We have been carried to the vista, drenched in awe. And then pulled back into the everyday. With the sting of enlightenment. Just one or two more of these. I'll wrap it up soon, I promise. Thank you all very much for your patience. And I hope this is making sense and is audible. Got a million tabs open, bear with me. Here we go. A long-lost session of John Coltrane's quartet, released 55 years after the fact. Pulsation emerges, forms a web of relation that entangles anyone in its reach. It is the sound of pendular motion, a pair of fingers on low strings, hands bearing sticks on hammered metal and skin, fingers and palms splayed across the keys, all supported by a group of human forearms in various manifestations, wielded at all angles, lifted by muscles and falling with or faster than gravity, being lifted again, falling again, lifting again. We hear in these motions a set of sustained relations to the earth, ways of landing, ways of lifting, the flood of details that surround the pulse, the resonant piano chords landing firmly on upbeats, the miraculous runs lifting up the beat, the supporting barrage of cymbal patterns, snare attacks, toms, rim shots, bass drum kicks, the resolutely dancing bass, depicting ways of holding pulse while living life, moving together their freedoms in synchrony. The saxophonist becomes an odd counterexample in his own band. The location of pulse in his body is largely unrelated to gravity. It exists by analogy. It comes from breath, embouchure, and fingering. And it appears in the timing of individual notes with respect to one another and to the rhythms of the band. His actions relate more directly to speech than to walking. supported by a column of air that must be replenished between phrases, articulated by the tongue and the throat, accompanied by minute gesticulations of the fingers held sideways. The drummer Roy Haynes said of Coltrane, he had the world's greatest drummer inside him. The time emanates from within. That drummer inside is the one who walks, pulsation moving across the legs and torso in a balanced periodic distribution, a sturdy ambulatory homunculus, a bouncing inner version of the self that supports the actions of the outer self who stands more still. That is the framework across which these canvases are stretched. The temporal armature of music is synchronous movement. So we may attend to what that movement sounds like, how the bodies lift and land with and against each other. In this quartet, pulse is paramount. It is not a mere afterthought. It is the crux of the music's action. Given that, there is also much to say about the spectrum of information that appears across such strongly pulsed time. A listening ear constantly darts from the shape and color of one expressed idea to the way it pertains to the underlying form, to the feeling as it lands in rhythmic relation, to the way other players kick around responses, support, and push back. So-called solos are still emanations of the group, in what Fred Moten likened to a solar flare, foregrounding not an individual, but an aspect of the whole, a mode of collective excitation. About a month later, I find myself playing a couple of those very same Coltrane compositions with the late saxophonist's and the late pianist's own son, Ravi Coltrane, himself an imposing musician. We tucked into that opening blues, a compact, slickly severe figure known only as Untitled Original 11383. I found that it engenders a way of playing that is iconically of that quartet. Familiar sounds that you might call McCoy-isms or Elvin-ish for their faithful imitation of Tyner's and Jones's rhythms and colors. But it was also somehow that I was carried forth into that tributary, almost involuntarily. One surrenders to a familiar set of decisions, a well-traveled network of actions, and it manifests as a hexis, a particular way of holding oneself while acting. The splay of the hands, the swaggering intensity of attack, the rhythm and density, the outpouring of the self. Though familiar and possibly cliché, there is nothing closed or unfree about the feeling. It is as though Ravi's presence as the son of Alice and John gives us license to step on with him into that iconic, storied, raging river of sound and spirit. Can I do one more? How are you all doing? I don't want to tax you. Go for it. One more. All right. I'm just playing DJ up here, so you'll see why I said that in a moment. It starts all of a sudden. You move in your biped frame, but the arpeggio comes in threes, orbiting and breaking your symmetry. Its brutality is that it does not change. As it hangs in the air, you start to notice different things about it, like an endless polyphonic crystal. You notice the reverb cloud that seems to hang in the background, reactivated every so often. Then this cloud coalesces into a single note that isn't in the existing chord. This B natural forms a shifting moire pattern with the top B flat of the G minor arpeggio. It ping-pongs around that top note, toggling among a half dozen possibilities, forming iterative, machinic blues relations. Is this a song or some other thing? We are left to contemplate the eventfulness of what is transpiring, the percolating half-step shifts as form, as melody, as something that captures your ear. Do you feel guided? The question I must ask when taking on this exercise is, what are my analytical details doing in relation to what the music is doing? How do I prevent the tools of musical analysis from abstracting away from the music's function, or ignoring the conditions to and under which the music is responding? What is hiding from such analysis is how these musics reconfigure their spaces, reorder sociality. Musicality as relation. To listen in earphones is to remain fixed in a single spatial orientation to the music. You are a lone stationary observer, pinned to the sweet spot of the stereo image. But to be in a room with other bodies, with sounds bouncing off of every surface, feels quite different. One moves through and is immersed in the very same air that is the vibratory medium of sound. The bass frequencies hit you in the stomach. They modulate the air in stride-length sine waves. The high end of the hi-hats flood the atmosphere, clatter off the ceiling, lift the hair off the nape of your neck. Panned synthetic tones float impossibly around the room. The tweak of a filter knob makes objects change color on a temporal arc that fuses with your mounting emotional state. The music is not of you, it seems not to be of anybody, and yet you feel guided, invited to move and feel and merge with it. Musicality emerges not simply as the interplay of the song's formal attributes, but in your very relationship to the floor and the walls and the ceiling, the vibratory excitations of the very air you breathe into, the co-beings alongside whom you maneuver and sweat and live, with whom you dissolve into collective sensation and action. These worlds that call you into them did not exist until they did, 3 or 6 or 10 decades ago, in post-industrial American cities. This you is therefore also new. These new musical and human relations are the historically emergent result of Black invention. I do not mean to romanticize this quality. As a non-Black person with considerable privilege, I do not intend to make a callous, ineffectual, warm assurance about Black music and liberation. Rather, I'm trying to listen as closely as I can to moments of instability and insurrection in which Black subjectivities, Black music makers, Black counterpublics sonically hearken, new ways of living, relating, listening, and being, new arrangements of time and space, new imaginings of the social, bending, breaking, burrowing under or flying over the existing order of things, collectively conjuring otherwise sonic architecture, offering not only an affirmation of Black life, but as Fred Moten has put it, a real problem and a real chance for the philosophy of the human being. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much. You've been very kind. keep going. If you're not tired yet, thank you very much for your response. If you're not tired yet, I think I'm willing to take some questions, but if you have to jet, it's okay too. I won't be offended. I know people have other things to do, and I'm grateful that you stuck with us.
And I have a microphone if you would like to make your question known without yelling, or you may be able to just project. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question.
I stand up. Hey, I want to ask, as someone from the Indian diaspora, studying music from different cultures, how do you take who you are as a person, find the connections, and then present that in a musical way to an audience in an honest way?
Thank you for that question. It's little by little. It's a learning process. It's a collaborative process. It's a lot of trial and error. The truth has a way of shaking down and coming through your creations, whether you want it to or not. So when you say an honest way, what would it mean? I mentioned earlier this morning the outtakes to Coltrane's recording of Giant Steps. At some point he says, I'm trying to tell a story on these changes, but I don't want to tell no lies. So what would that mean? What does it mean to not be honest musically? Maybe you could tell me what you think that means.
A lot of times, especially as a student, you're in music school, you're trying to digest a lot of stuff, a lot of different music from a lot of different contexts, and in that process of learning through imitation, the line between when you're imitating and when you're taking something and making it yours, in a way gets really blurred. So how do you tackle that line?
Yeah. I think over time you develop a sense slowly of what matters to you. You might feel cornered into having to do that, as someone of the South Asian diaspora, as you mentioned, to somehow keep reminding people musically that that's a fact about you. And I did that quite a bit in my early years, but I was also very conscious about not trivializing that. Well, for one thing, as I mentioned, I was living in California, in the California Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, which is sort of ground zero for hippie culture. Okay, so there was a lot of very fanciful ideas about what India was in the white hippie imagination. And I did not want any part of that. I didn't want to get caught up in what I used to call baubles, bangles, and beads. Okay, I didn't want to dress up the music to make it sound Indian. What I wanted to do was be able to play with Indian musicians so that we could actually relate and build something together. And I also wanted to just reach my own relationship to those histories, those legacies, some of which themselves are quite oppressive, and I don't want to reassert dominant cultures of India here. That's not of interest to me. It is sort of meaningless and a bit of a trap, I think. So what I wanted to do was just like find ways to relate on my own terms and on terms that were meaningful to me here with my community here. And my community here involved many people like you, but also many people not like either of us, you know. So it was kind of about that. It became like, how do I, on the ground level, build something together with somebody that matters to me, and matters to us in a way that then might matter to somebody else. And that's less, you know, because like what you described is kind of this top-down idea, like, well, I'm going to take 2/5 jazz and 2/5 India and 1/5, I don't know, Western classical, and make a martini of some kind out of all of that, a cosmopolitan or something, you know. And like, well, it's sort of like what, I keep quoting Coltrane because he's very full of quotes, but in that famous interview with Frank Kafsky, who asked him what he thought of third stream music, he said, well, it always seemed to me to be like an effort to make music out of labels, which is sort of, I think, getting at what you mean by honesty or the lack thereof, you know? So I always treat it like, well, what can I do from where I'm at with what I know and with the people around me who know what they know, and what can we build together? But also, how do I make contact with people who might not know any of that, you know? I mean, I know what you mean, because it's sort of like the other side of it is that when I first came into the public eye as someone who was out and about doing stuff, making records and playing shows, writing my own music and so forth, that kept being pinned onto me. Oh, he's the Indian American jazz musician. And then it would always be like, his music sounds Indian. His music doesn't sound Indian. Like, that was all that people would say, you know? And like, I, as a born and raised US person, you know, with that as one of several heritages that speak through me, wanted to make music on my own terms, whatever that meant, you know. So it's like kind of been an ongoing thing. Well, we could talk much more about it. I could just give a whole lecture on that. I should say, but thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just had a quick question. So towards the beginning of the presentation, you put up a slide with a lot of authors, some of them under the category of like Afro-pessimism, some more broadly just under more like modern Black studies. But so a lot of that particular scholarship is predicated on both a move from subjectivity to ontology, but also from the body to the flesh. And I was wondering, how does that fit in with the way that you're conceiving music and musicking as an interplay between bodies and subjects, or at least what appears to be how you're describing it? Do you feel that the former comes into any tension with the latter, or do you see them as concurrent? Just wondering.
Wow, that's a very good question. Thanks for picking up on that tension, and it's true. Well, you know, when we speak of the body, or of bodies plural, we're still speaking of individual autonomous figures, right? And part of what's happening in some of this, and I tried to kind of touch on it in my attempts to narrate Coltrane's quartet music, and also to narrate that piece of Detroit techno, which is not just what it does to you, an individual, but what it articulates about an entity that is not one person, you know? Like, and even in the way I described your relationship to the room, like as you become kind of part of this larger assemblage, your flesh and your, the fragments of you become part of this larger assemblage that is not reducible to the subject. You become part of an aggregate that is about multiplicity, about relation, about relations between beings and objects. And so that is maybe a space where some of that tension I was trying to address it. I don't tend to use the discourse of flesh so much, or that term as a kind of, in all its potency in the way that it has been used, partly because I feel like that's not my place, But I am aware and informed by it, and it informs my perspectives on musical cultures and musicking, these kind of subcultural moments where individualism is sort of subsumed into something else.
Thank you.
Does that help? Am I even
Very helpful,
in
thank
the right ballpark here?
Perfect.
Hi. So, generally, how can we use our imagination to better connect with the music? And in another form, what is it to engage with music as opposed to listen to music? And how would you put yourself in a state where you are more open to the perceptive state of mind that the music, I'm sorry.
The mic is drifting away. Could you
Oh,
just
sorry.
ask the whole question again?
Yeah, so how can we use our imagination to connect with music? And in another form, what is it to engage with music as opposed to listen to it?
Okay, those are two interesting questions. I'm not sure how equipped I am to answer them, but I'll just give you a seat of the pants answer. Well, I mean, part of what I was doing in my quasi-narrations or voice-overs or voice-unders, trying to talk along with and even observe and narrate what I was observing. And then offering that as like, this is what you hear, which is not necessarily true. You might not hear what I hear. But I imagine that might be the case. And so like I'm imagining a sense of community with you who's sitting there listening to me, okay? Part of what it is to listen to music without seeing, which is something, again, that we've only been able to do for a century or so, to hear recorded music, is to then like be required or invited into a fantasy about who made it and where they were, what they looked like, what were they wearing, were they men or women or both or neither? What kind of space is it? So you start to imagine bodies. And as soon as you do that, you start to ascribe qualities like gender and ethnicity and race and sexuality to those bodies. And that is imagination. So there's like a kind of recorded music asks you to engage in a fantasy about the origins of what you are hearing. And at this point, like I said, we're so accustomed to that just sort of everywhere that we don't really think about that. We just kind of accept it. But that is the sort of strange provocation that recorded music offered into the world that was not there before. There was no such thing until that happened. Well, I guess you could point to like player pianos or music boxes, or, objects that made music with nobody inside them, right? So that is already an invitation to imagine the who and the what and the how of it. In terms of like what is engagement versus listening, I'm not sure that I see those words as opposed. I think, and I actually don't care what you call it. I think what matters maybe is like making music matter to you on your terms, and being part of maybe a community larger than yourself of people who might share that sense of mattering. And you can call it, that can be in whatever way. Like I can't predict, I don't know, you guys some of you are like 30 years younger than me. So you've had a very different relationship to the musical universe than I have, When I was a kid in high school, I used to like go to the local public library and rummage through the LPs and then borrow the ones that looked cool and take them home and dub them on cassette, and hope I wouldn't get busted for doing that. And that was basically how I learned everything I knew about, So now it's like you're faced with this kind of ubiquity and kind of like hyperabundance. And so then, what I do find from a lot of young people is this almost like a malaise or a fatigue or a kind of melancholy, What should I listen to? People will ask me, what's a good Charlie Parker record? I'm like, all of them, right? So it's hard to find your way through that abundance. But I think it happens through community. It happens through gatherings, through like study groups, or like hanging out with people. And I remember like when I lived in Oakland, my friend had a car with a broken cassette player in it. This is in the 90s. And there was a Wayne Shorter album stuck in there. So every time he'd drive me, it's like, yep, there's that Speak No Evil again. That's it, So like we used to hear that like it was months. It was in there for months, So that kind of thing. You become really attached to one thing and it kind of like organizes your whole world. It's very hard to even have an experience like that today. So I hear where you're coming from.
I think Vijay's ride to the airport leaves in about 3 minutes, so.
Could do one more if there is one, but otherwise I'm happy to.
Just a quick question. What's your everyday process, like as a musician, like you structure that kind of thing into your life, like how do you structure the practicing and like composing into your life? Is that something you just do when you feel like it?
It's hard. There are phases when I'm kind of like, okay, I'm playing at the Village Vanguard. I need to be in shape, so I'm gonna like do the kind of the equivalent of weightlifting or something. But just like trying to be ready to play, 15 hours of music in front of an audience in a very compressed amount of time. And so there's that kind of like regimen that kicks in when that time is approaching. More there's no regularity because my schedule, I mean, aside from pandemic era kind of stasis, my schedule is pretty haphazard. Like every day is a bit of a different adventure. You know, today was an adventure. They had the piano time arranged for me, but I didn't have time to do it because I was like making slides and stuff. So, and you know, sometimes I have projects looming, like I'm writing right now a cello concerto that's going to premiere on October 1st. So that gives me like, okay, every day I need to think about the cello concerto in some way, whether it's like I don't know if I'm going to put in 6 hours at a desk every day, but I might like rethink the materials I've already assembled, or I might reorganize the form of it in my head, or I might listen to some other cello concertos and say like, well, what did this guy do? What did Benjamin Britten do? Or what did Sofia Gubaidulina do? You know, like what are these different, how do other people tackle the same problem of like pitting an individual against 100 other musicians, you know? So like that, just like basic stuff like that, that to me is also part of the process. So it's just trying to keep it alive to me in some way. That's, yeah. So it's a lot of different things because I find myself doing a lot of different musical things, you know. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Rochester, much appreciated. Thank you.